Hello everyone, and welcome to a new online session where we're going to talk about the basics of ventilation waveforms, hopefully in less than 30 minutes. So basically we're trying to get the basics. We're not going to dive really deep. So we're trying to just to improve the understanding of ventilation waveforms for some of you guys who are not familiar with it, to help guide you manage the ventilated patients and understand the dynamic change in ventilation as they're not static statuses. What do we need to learn from our waveforms? Well, I'm not hoping for you guys to be like that guy on the right. He's basically a magician or a wizard, or he's got like some special abilities, because from the ventilation waveforms, he could predict if there's some autopeep coming up, which is fine, but he also can predict that the flow needs to be upped, the ET tube can come back 2 centimeters, and that the Foley catheter or the Foley bag is full. So he's an amazing guy, and he also wants, he knows that the patient wants to watch the Lions game. But what I want you to get out of the ventilation waveforms is at least to understand how to set your targets according to what targets you're achieving and what's happening with the ventilation. Try to get a grip of the compliance, detect if there's any autopeep, if the patient is synchronized. Most importantly, know how to set your appropriate inspiratory time and avoid the barotrauma and volutrauma to your patients. So let's talk about the most commonly used waveforms. So we've got the pressure versus time, the flow versus time, volume versus time, and these are all dynamic curves that keep going against time. And then there's the pressure versus volume, which is basically a loop rather than a curve. So we're going to start with the most common curves against time. So on your left side here, you're going to see what you would expect to see on any of the volume targeted modes, where you're basically setting your the volume as your main target for the patient. These are the modes that we usually use with adults, adolescents or teenagers, and a bit of the group of above 10 years of children, because of the physiology being more reliable on targeting volumes, and that's a big discussion that we can't go through right now. On the other side, these are the curves that you would expect with pressure targeted modes, where you're putting your pressure or setting the pressure as your target, and these are the modes that we usually use with neonates, infants, or little children, because of also different physiologic targets. But having said that, sometimes with little children we use volume modes, and sometimes with big kids or even with adults we use pressure modes, depending on the disease as well. So there's a lot to understand about which mode goes where, but that's another discussion for another day. So if you've got a patient that is set on a volume targeted mode, so basically your target is the volume here. So this is the volume against time. So you've set the volume and it's static. Everything else is basically is going to be changed according to the status of the lung with every breath. So the pressure should not be static, and the flow might not be as static as you would expect it, although on volume modes is mostly a bit on the static side. You would expect the pressure against time curve to look like that usually, and the flow against time in volume target modes are usually square-like, although there are different types of flow against time. I'm not going to go through a lot of details, and the volume against time will go like this, and we're going to go through details with the next couple of or 3 slides. On the pressure target modes, you're setting your pressure, so it should be static, and your ventilator is targeting it in a static fashion as a maximum target. The flow would usually be of a descending nature, and then goes, so this is the inspiratory limb, and then this is the expiratory limb. Same here, inspiratory, expiratory limbs. And then on the volume, it's not that much different, but it's going to be changing with every breath because it's not your target. Okay? And downstairs, you're going to notice some of the famous modes, like the on the pressure control modes. You're going to find the PRVC, sine wave of the PRVC type, and pressure support and the volume support. And on the other side, the sine wave of the volume control type. But basically, let's go through one by one of them. So pressure against time, or pressure versus time, is one of the basic but also important curves. So we're going to start with the volume target pressure versus time curves. So on the volume target modes, your pressure versus time curve would usually look like this. So the breath goes in against resistance because the lung is still deflated, or like it's not in the best status. So think about your first breath with a balloon, how deep you need to push, or how strong your breath should be to open up the balloon initially, because you're breathing against resistance, but then becomes easier. So with the first push against the lung, usually because now the pressure is not the target, the volume is the target, the ventilator will overshoot because it's fighting against resistance. But then after that shot, trying to rationalize to the volume, the amount of pressure needed to keep that volume in, to get to that volume and keep it in for the inspiration time, is usually less than the push for against resistance to inflate the lung. So again, the ventilator pushes against resistance to open the lung, and then keeps a static pressure to keep the volume in for the rest of the inspiration period, and then releases and everything goes out. So that peak there, the overshooting peak, is called pressure peak, as you would expect it. And then this bit here is called pressure plateau. What does that mean? Why is that important? Basically, this bit here, or the difference between the delta P, which is the difference between the peak pressure and the plateau pressure, is basically giving you an idea about the resistance you're dealing with, which might be all related to the lung status if you nullify everything else, but actually you can't. So part of it is the tube itself. If it's narrow, if it needs suction, if it needs clearance, then that would tell you something about it. And again, if your PEEP is not enough to get the lung in a better status to make it easy for the next breath, then you might need to get the PEEP a bit up to try to nullify that amount of resistance there. While the whole curve, especially from the peak plateau, pressure plateau, down to the baseline of the PEEP, because this is basically the PEEP, sorry I didn't say that, is telling you the story about the elastic work, which is the compliance. So this is the compliance, and this is the resistance. And you need to work out what to do with what to make the curve more smooth and get the lung in a better status with every breath. On the other hand, pressure control, pressure versus time curves are usually less dramatic. So the ventilator is usually targeting a peak pressure that you've set, and it gets there, keeps it there for the inspiration time, and goes down. It usually is more square-like, not really like that, but these are also some curves you would expect to see. So this is the most seen curve, to be honest, which might mean that you're not inflating the lung fully. This is what you would expect if you're getting the right pressure. But again, because there's also inspiratory time, usually there is a bit of a plateau and then it goes down. If it's peaking like that, then you're causing barotrauma and volutrauma, which is overdistension. But again, if it's like a shark fin, then there's room for more pressure for the lung. And that's what we call stress index 1, which is, as I said, the normal. Stress index more than 1 is over the distension. Stress index less than 1, which is basically tidal recruitment. So it's recruiting the lung slowly, but there's still room. What can we learn from the pressure versus time curve more than just what we've said? Well, you can learn if the patient is breathing for their own, triggering. So if the patient is causing negative pressure at the beginning of the breath, then the patient is triggering or breathing or trying to breathe, which is usually good news if the patient had a CNS problem. But sometimes it's bad news if you're not aiming for it and trying to sedate the patient, paralyze the patient for some reason. So it depends on your targets, it depends on what you're aiming for, what you want to see, and what type of ventilation you're aiming. But this is what you can learn from it. Also, in basically in volume control mode, some of the old ventilators, I would say most of the new ventilators have already got a standard flow adjustment, but some of the old ventilators would need you to adjust the flow for yourself or on your own. So sometimes the way the ascending limb of the inspiration limb, the way it's going, is telling you if you need to adjust the flow. So this is how it should be if the flow is adequate, but if it goes anywhere like that, then you need to get the flow higher. Again, we don't really use that much in peds, but also just in case you're using an old ventilator and using volume target modes for some reason. On the volume target mode again, if the plateau time is so short like that, because as we said, this is where you're just inflating the lung against resistance, but this is what you need to keep the volume for a proper inspiratory time. So if the plateau is really short, then the inspiratory time is so short and you're not achieving what you need to keep the compliance going in the right direction. So at least when you see that on a volume target mode, you know that you need to increase the inspiratory time. Okay. Let's see. Flow versus time curve, which is, well, for me is I would like to consider the most important curve on the against time curves, but that's just my own bias. But I think you can learn a lot from flow versus time. So basically, flow versus time has got two sides of the isometric line. So one of them is upwards, which is the inspiratory limb, and then the other one is the downside, which is the expiratory limb. So basically, the ventilator pushes as much flow as it can to achieve the target. So if it's a pressure, if the target is the pressure, as soon as the pressure gets high enough, then the flow keeps going steady to keep that pressure. So that to go steady, to keep a pressure, if you can think about it, again with the balloon example, if you're inflating a balloon, then at some point you just keep going with a minimal flow and you can feel the pressure against you. So the pressure can be kept going down with the flow, but just not releasing. So if you release, the whole air goes out really quickly because it's against high pressure. So you go in really quickly because the lung is having not it doesn't have anything except for the PEEP from the pressure point of view, and then the ventilator keeps going down with the flow steady, really slowly, and then the valves close and keep the pressure in until the inspiratory time is done, and then the flow goes quickly out, and then there's a steady decline of the flow because of the amount going out. Usually it goes out really slowly after the highest pressure pushes out, which is basically physics. With volume modes, you can have either this way or the square flow curve or the mildly descending one. And that is usually adjusted by the ventilator. You can choose which type of flow you want, but the one that is used the most with volume target modes is the square flow curve, in which the flow keeps being steady for all the inspiratory time with the same amount to keep the volume in not considering how much pressure it's causing. Okay, what can we learn? Looking just at what we can see here. So again, if you give the right time for inspiration, then the inspiratory curve should go down to the zero line or the isometric line with smoothly, with not being interrupted, being taken quickly down. And the expiratory limb should also go back to the line really smoothly, not being interrupted. Why is that important? Because that is going to tell you about your inspiratory time. Is it set so low, so long? What you need to do about it. So if you look here, so again, this seems like a pressure target mode. So the inspiratory flow curve is interrupted, taken down really quickly with the expiratory phase before going back smoothly to the zero line. While here it goes back to the zero line, but it doesn't keep the pressure for long enough. It gets really cut down quickly. Here it seems appropriate because it goes back to the zero line, keeps the pressure in for some time, and then goes down. This is a safety net for you because, again, the lung status is dynamic. So with some points, this might change, and that what seemed like a proper inspiratory time can be just enough. So with the next 4 or 5 breaths, that might be the case. So if you've already set it like this, then in 4 or 5 breaths, you might get that or that, you don't know, but you're here. But here, if you keep that being, this little shoulder being your safety net, then usually you're in a safe place. And again, it's better to keep the lung in better status. Your tidal volume is usually the area under the curve, which is this area. So as much as you can give as an inspiratory time in these cases, as much tidal volume you're gonna get. So it's not just about the pressure. Again, even if it's pressure target mode, you want some tidal volume to be adequate to get the best oxygenation and ventilation. So if you look here, the area under the curve is so small. Here, it's absolutely fine because again, no matter how much you increase afterwards, you're gonna get the same area under the curve. So you don't need to increase further, just enough to keep a safety net. Or if you're following your ventilator, you can just keep it here. But my point is, this is too short. Longer than that is going to be so long. So either here or there is right. Okay? What about the expiratory limb? Expiratory limb is really useful to tell you something about the pathology of the lung, because the time that the time that the lungs need to get all of the air out would tell you something about how high is the resistance against that air to go out. So if the air goes out in long time, then that means the resistance is high. While if it goes out smoothly in appropriate time, then the resistance is low, because now here, as soon as the valve got released, everything got out really quickly, and then the remaining part came out in a mathematical fashion. While here, although the pressure was high, you managed only to get this amount out, and the rest had to take all of that time to go out. So the resistance is high in this case, which means this here represents an obstructive lung disease, like asthma, like bronchiolitis, like COPD in adults, where the resistance is so high against exhaling. Why is that important? Because if the next breath comes in before the previous breath goes all out, then you're gonna cause a problem. What kind of problem? Well, that problem is what we call autopeep, because you're keeping some air in the lung and adding to it. So what is PEEP? PEEP is the peak and expiratory pressure. So you're deliberately keeping some pressure, some minimal flow, some air going to the lung on the background not related to breath, to keep the lungs minimally open, to make it easier for the next breath to inflate without a lot of resistance, right? But the problem with Autopeep that you're not accounting for it. You're not counting that, and the ventilator is not picking that up. So the lungs keep distending with each breath coming really early, adding to what is left in from the previous one. And with every breath, the alveoli keeps distending to the point that they might burst and you can get pneumothorax. The other problem is, even if they don't burst, the quality of the tidal volume that can be shifted with the amount of pressure you're putting is going to be not enough. So if you're setting a PIP or a peak pressure of 20, 25, let's say, and you had a peep of 6 initially, and then the auto peep kept being there, then ideally the pressures are adding in there, and then the delta P that you've got from the PIP that you had, which is 25, is going to be in reality different, and then the tidal volume is going to be less. Okay? And you'll end up needing higher pressures to keep ventilating, which means barotrauma. And because of the Autopeep being a lot of volume living in the lungs, then you're also going to have volutrauma eventually. So you're harming the lung, and at some point it's going to be really difficult to ventilate the patient, and it can affect the hemodynamics as well. And that's also a big discussion for later. Okay, volume versus time is a simple one. So basically inspiration, expiration, and this is the maximum volume. If you got a longer inspiratory time, you might have a bit of a plateau here, but other than that, that's how the curve looks like. What can we learn from this curve? Basically, the most important bit is if the expiratory limb goes back to the baseline, because if it doesn't, then that means there's some volume being missed on the expiration, which means air leak, either in the circuit or in the patient, like pneumothorax. Or if the volume keeps going up, then it might be not air leak actually, but autopeep, as we just mentioned, because now you're adding to the volume that is living there. So if the amount of volume is not going up with subsequent breath, then it's usually air leak. But if it's going up, it's usually autopeep. Again, you need to use the waves together. You need to look at what's happening with the volume curve and what's happening with the flow curve, and all of them together with the pressure curve as well. Like in this example, to set the appropriate I time. So here it looked like it was enough, but when you increased it, there was potential for more, and that added more to the volume. So the volume here was 450 and now it's 500, just because you've increased the inspiratory time. So if you've looked at the flow curve alone, you would have thought that was enough. If you'd looked at the volume curve alone, you would have thought that is fine. But if you played with them together, you can see what you're doing and adding to the potential of your ventilation. Okay, quick quiz. What's wrong with this patient? Let's start with what mode is this? Yes, it's a pressure target mode, because the pressure curve has got a plateau without a peak, and the flow curve goes down in a descending way. So putting these together looks like a pressure target mode. What is wrong with this patient? What do we need to adjust with the ventilation here? Yes, what's happening here is we've got autopeep, because the expiratory limb on the flow curve doesn't go back in a nice way. The I time looks fine. So what can we do to fix it? Basically get the rate down. And to be honest, any patient who needs I time of 0.9, then usually I would say the age here is not an infant. So a respiratory rate of 42 seems a lot of rate for this patient. And I think they're trying to fix the high CO2 by increasing the rate. But in this case, they're actually doing the opposite, because they're increasing the rate, to the point that they're not giving time for the CO2 to go out. So they're actually accumulating CO2 by not getting the rate down. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to talk about the only loop that we're discussing today. There's a lot of other loops, but this seems always to be the most important, most discussed loop, which is the pressure volume loop. So what are we studying here? So we're studying pressure on the horizontal side against volume. So the amount of pressure that we're beginning away, at, that is away from the 0 bit, is the peep, basically. So we're allowing for about, let's say this is pressure 0 and this is pressure, let's say 5. So we've got like a peep of 5 or peep of 8 or whatever. And the breath starts from here going against, like, anti-clockwise, because we're having post-pressure ventilation, right? So this is the inspiration limb. So you can imagine, you can notice that you give some pressure, but the change of the volume is minimal. This is because, again, the initial bit of the breathe is against resistance. You can try to adjust that if the curve is showing low compliance by setting the peep higher until you get to the inflection point where the change of pressure with the change of volumes are adequate, or the change of volume with the change of pressure is adequate. And then the inspiration limb goes all the way up to your maximum pressure that you've set, or the maximum pressure that you get with the volume that you've set. And then the expiratory limb comes up here. So the imaginary line that goes in the middle is representing the compliance. So if it's going like this, the compliance is lower. If it's going like this, the compliance is higher. This should be ideal with a 45 degrees. Okay, the how further away you get with your inspiration limb from that imaginary line is representing the inspiratory resistance. And how further away you go with this curve, the expiration curve, from that imaginary line is representing your expiration resistance. Okay? Here's another way to show it on the right side. So P here is 0. So this is all a zone of atelectasis until you get to the pressure of the inflection point, lower inflection point. So you need to get your P closer to the lower inflection point. And then the curve goes up. If you keep going with your PIP, or you've set a volume that needs a lot of pressure to achieve it, you're going to notice that you're going to get to this point, to that peaking here. That peaking here means that no matter how much pressure you give, the change of volume is less. This is the area of trauma. You're causing over distension. You're causing a lot of trauma. So you need to stop here at the upper inflection point, which might make sense. Okay? Because you're just over distending the lung and causing harm. And then the expiration happens when you release. Okay? What can we learn from the pressure volume loop? What type of breath we're having? Is it controlled, all generated by the ventilator, anti-clockwise? Have we got negative pressure or a type of negative pressure happening and then going with the mechanical ventilation, which is the assisted way, or is all spontaneous, going from negative to positive? Okay, we can learn about the compliance. So in a pressure controlled ventilation, pressure changes volumes less, then the compliance is less. Pressure changes volumes a lot, then the compliance is better. So if the curve goes to the right side, the compliance is less. The other way around, the compliance is better. Volume controlled ventilation. So again, it's basically the same, because if the curve goes here, the compliance is less, because no matter, it's again about the change with the pressure and the volume. So there's no real difference between both of them. Okay. You can also learn about the resistance, because apparently with this curve, there was a lot of resistance to inflate the lung, and then suddenly the lung was all over inflated. And then on the way back, the resistance was also high for the expiratory limb. What is that telling you? This is telling you that basically the ventilator is struggling against some kind of resistance at the beginning that doesn't represent what the lung is really having. So this seems like a tube problem. Either the patient is biting the tube is partially obstructed, you need to sort, or the tube is really small, you need to sort the tube. Here it's different. So the inspiratory limb seems fine, but the expiratory limb seems further away from there. That might just be a bit of expiratory problem. So maybe a marginal obstructed lung, uh, uh, maybe basically a bronchoconstriction, something like that. Again, it's more evident here. So this is where the inspiration is fine, expiration is far away. So that is bronchospasm or bronchoconstriction. You might benefit from bronchodilation here. Here, the resistance high both ways. So again, difficulty to inflate, and then suddenly poof, and then the expiration is difficult. This is a problem with either the tube or the airway. Here, the expiration doesn't go back to baseline from the volume point of view, so there's missed volume. This is leak. And this is a super duper great compliance, which is basically representing emphysema. You need to wean this patient and decrease the pressures and the volumes you're giving. Or maybe think about eventually getting them off positive pressure ventilation. Okay, final quiz, because we're just managed to get that in 30 minutes or 31 minutes, sorry. What type of ventilation we're using here with this curve? What type of curve and what type of ventilation? Correct, flow curve, flow versus time curve, and this is volume targeted ventilation. What about here? What type of ventilation? Yes, that is usually pressure targeted ventilation, and this is again the full flow versus time curve. What is the problem with this one? Correct, we need more eye time for this patient because apparently the curve is not going back to the baseline from the inspirator point of view. Great. So take home message: you need to understand the waveforms and loops to get a grip of what you're doing with your ventilation. You need to know your targets, and you need to know that they're dynamic and they can keep changing because the lung status is always dynamic. So keep reading your waveforms and loops all together, relying on them as a way to read your patient and a way to monitor your patient as well. Thank you very much. Any feedback on the comments section will be appreciated, and I'm gonna be happy to address any questions. Thank you very much. Bye.